June 6, 1944.
The
5 a.m.
It's impossible.
Crisbecq Battery, Cotentin Peninsula, Normandy. Oberleutnant See Walter Ohmsen pressed his Zeiss binoculars against the reinforced concrete embrasure of his observation post and swept them across the pre-dawn horizon. The 32-year-old naval artillery officer had spent 18 months commanding this battery. 4 280mm Czech-made Škoda cannons positioned to dominate the approaches to Utah Beach. He had drilled his crews until they could fire 12 rounds per minute. He had studied the tide tables, calculated firing solutions for every conceivable approach vector, prepared range cards for targets stretching 15 miles into the English Channel. Nothing in that preparation had readied him for what materialized through the lifting darkness. The English Channel had vanished. In its place stretched a carpet of steel extending from horizon to horizon, an unbroken mass of vessels so dense that the water itself seemed to have transformed into metal. Ohmsen attempted to count the ships closest to his position. He reached 100 and abandoned the effort. The mathematics were incomprehensible. German naval intelligence had estimated that the Allies could assemble perhaps 3,000 vessels for an invasion attempt. What Ohmsen witnessed through his rangefinder exceeded that figure by more than double, and still the ships continued emerging from the morning haze, an endless procession of military power converging on the Norman coast. The invasion armada that Ohmsen observed comprised 6,739 vessels manned by over 195,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied nations. The fleet included 1,113 warships ranging from battleships to motor torpedo boats, 4,226 landing craft of every conceivable type, 736 ancillary vessels providing support functions, and 864 merchant ships converted for military transport. The organizational achievement required to assemble, coordinate, and deploy such a force exceeded anything in naval history. Yet to Ohmsen, watching from his concrete fortress, the fleet represented something more fundamental than military capability. It was the physical manifestation of industrial capacity that Nazi propaganda had assured him could not exist. At 5:52 a.m., Crisbecq Battery received orders to engage. 3 minutes later, at 5:55 a.m., Ohmsen's 210mm guns fired their first salvos toward the approaching armada. The shells arced across 6 miles of water toward targets that German gunners had rehearsed engaging for months. The battery concentrated its fire on the American cruisers USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy, and the battleship USS Nevada, veteran of Pearl Harbor, now returned to combat. The German shells raised towering columns of spray around the American warships. Some found their targets. At approximately 6:30 a.m., concentrated fire from Crisbecq Battery struck the destroyer USS Corey, which would sink within the hour, the only American destroyer lost on D-Day. Ohmsen had drawn blood. His battery, his Maimo, had proven that the Atlantic Wall possessed teeth. Yet even as smoke rose from the stricken Corey, the German commander understood the futility of his achievement. For every shell his guns fired, hundreds answered from the invasion fleet. For every ship damaged, dozens passed unharmed toward the beaches. The mathematics that had seemed favorable in training exercises revealed their irrelevance against an opponent who measured capability in thousands rather than dozens. Ohmsen would later describe the experience with brutal clarity. Firing at that armada was like throwing stones at an incoming tide. 50 miles inland, at Army Group B headquarters in the Château de la Roche-Guyon, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel monitored increasingly alarming reports through the pre-dawn hours. As Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel since April 15, 1944, Speidel bore responsibility for coordinating the defense of the French coast in his commander's absence. Rommel himself had departed for Germany on June 4th to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday on June 6th, and to request a meeting with Hitler regarding reinforcement of the Norman sector. The weather forecast had promised continued storms, conditions that would make amphibious operations impossible. Rommel had calculated he could spare 3 days from the front. The first indication that something extraordinary was occurring reached Speidel at 1:20 a.m. 7th Army Headquarters reported massive parachute drops across the Cotentin Peninsula and the area east of the Orne River. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions of the United States Army, comprising over 13,000 paratroopers, were descending through the Norman night, delivered by 822 Douglas C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft. Simultaneously, the British 6th Airborne Division was landing east of the invasion beaches, securing the left flank of the assault area. The scale of the airborne operation exceeded any previous deployment in military history. Speidel's initial assessment reflected the uncertainty that characterized German command decisions throughout the early morning hours. Were these landings a diversion, intended to draw German reserves away from the actual invasion site at Pas-de-Calais? Were they a major operation, or an elaborate raid? The confusion stemmed partly from the scattered nature of the airborne drops, with paratroopers landing across a wide area due to navigation errors and anti-aircraft fire. But it also reflected a fundamental failure of imagination. German planners had prepared for an invasion they could conceptualize, one that resembled their own capabilities multiplied by reasonable factors. They had not prepared for an industrial avalanche that operated on entirely different principles. General der Artillerie Erich Marx received word of the parachute landings at his headquarters in Saint-Lô, where he commanded LX Saxois Corps, responsible for defending the Norman coast. The 53-year-old Marx possessed combat experience that few German officers could match. He had lost his left leg at the Battle of Stalingrad, walking with an artificial limb that did nothing to diminish his tactical acuity. Marx understood immediately that the airborne drops signaled something larger than a raid. His corps occupied precisely the sector where the landings were occurring. Whatever was coming would fall on his shoulders first. Marx attempted to reach Rommel in Germany, but found communication disrupted by French resistance sabotage of telephone lines. He contacted 7th Army Headquarters and urged the immediate release of armored reserves. The response reflected the paralysis that would characterize German command decisions throughout D-Day. The reserves could not be released without authorization from OKW, Hitler's headquarters, and Hitler was asleep. No one dared wake him. The Führer had given standing orders that he alone would authorize movement of the armored reserves held in strategic positions. Those reserves would remain frozen for critical hours while the invasion force established itself ashore. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, serving as naval advisor to Rommel since November 1943, had spent months inspecting the Atlantic Wall defenses and arguing for their reinforcement. The 60-year-old Ruge, born into a naval family and educated in the traditions of the Imperial German Navy, understood maritime operations with an expertise few in the German command structure could match. He had pressed Rommel for more mines in the channel approaches, more obstacles on the beaches, more guns covering the obvious landing sites. Some of his recommendations had been implemented. Most had been constrained by shortages of materials, labor, and time. Ruge would later write in his memoir that the German defenders had prepared to fight the last war while the Allies brought the next one. The observation captured a truth that extended beyond tactical preparation to fundamental assumptions about industrial capacity. German planning reflected German capabilities extrapolated by reasonable factors. The Atlantic Wall represented the maximum effort a nation struggling with material shortages could sustain. German planners assumed their opponents faced similar constraints, that Allied industrial output had limits that could be calculated and countered. The armada now approaching the Norman coast demonstrated how catastrophically wrong those assumptions had been. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment commenced. The thunder that rolled across the Norman coast announced the arrival of firepower on a scale that German defenders had never experienced and could barely comprehend. Available to the Allied fleet were 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors. Their guns ranging from 5-inch destroyer weapons to 16-inch battleship main batteries capable of hurling shells weighing over a ton. For the next hour, this armada would transform the Atlantic wall from a defensive system into a landscape of craters, shattered concrete, and burning debris. The mathematics of the bombardment illustrated the industrial disparity that defined the entire campaign. The battleship USS Texas, veteran of the First World War now modernized for her final conflict, fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch main guns during the first hour of the bombardment. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds. In 60 minutes, this single vessel delivered 178 tons of high explosives onto German positions, more than many German artillery regiments possessed in total ammunition reserves for the entire invasion. The USS Nevada, resurrected from the mud of Pearl Harbor, where Japanese aircraft had left her burning on December 7, 1941, added her own 14-inch batteries to the bombardment. The symbolism was unmistakable. The ship that Japan had believed destroyed now returned to help destroy the Reich that Japan had allied with. Before the first Allied soldier set foot on the Normandy beaches, naval forces had fired approximately 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 shells from cruisers, and 3,500 shells from battleships. Contemporary estimates suggest this bombardment delivered roughly 130,000 tons of explosive ordnance onto German defensive positions along the 50-mile invasion front. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Commander-in-Chief West, would later testify to the impact with a phrase that captured German officers' psychological transformation. We had prepared to fight soldiers, but we found ourselves fighting factories. At 6:00 a.m., as naval shells continued pulverizing the Atlantic Wall, German defenders witnessed the second demonstration of Allied industrial superiority. The sky filled with aircraft, not in dozens or hundreds, but in thousands, formations so dense they seemed to darken the morning light. Allied air forces flew 14,674 sorties in support of the D-Day landings, an aerial armada that dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe could conceive of opposing. Fighter aircraft swept the skies clear of the few German planes that attempted to intervene. Medium bombers struck communication centers and transportation choke points throughout Normandy. Heavy bombers attacked targets deeper in France, interdicting any possibility of rapid reinforcement. The Luftwaffe in France possessed approximately 300 operational aircraft on June 6, 1944. Against the 14,674 Allied sorties, German air forces managed 319 sorties throughout the day. The ratio of 46 Allied aircraft for every German plane in the sky rendered traditional concepts of air defense meaningless. Major Joseph Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26 based at Lille, made the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches that morning. With just his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk, Priller dove through the Allied fighter screen, strafed Sword Beach once, and fled before the swarm of Spitfires and Thunderbolts could intercept him. This famous incident, documented in multiple historical accounts and later dramatized in film, demonstrated the complete impotence of German air power. 2 aircraft constituted the Luftwaffe's response to the largest amphibious invasion in history. At Widerstandsnest 62, a German strongpoint overlooking what would become known as Omaha Beach, Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh peered through his machine gun's firing slit as dawn revealed the approaching armada. The 20-year-old farm boy from Metzingen in Lower Saxony had never seen the ocean before his posting to Normandy. Now, according to his post-war account, he saw no ocean at all, only steel. Ships covered the water from horizon to horizon. Large ships, small ships, vessels with flat bottoms that rode low in the water, destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs managing a flock. Severloh attempted to count the vessels and abandoned the effort after reaching 100. There were thousands. The psychological impact of that moment, the sudden visceral understanding that everything German propaganda had promised about Allied weakness was false, would mark German defenders across the entire invasion front. They had been told Americans were soft, corrupted by luxury, incapable of the sacrifices that industrial warfare demanded. They had been assured that Allied production could never match German quality, that the Third Reich's technological superiority would overcome any numerical disadvantage. The armada approaching through the morning haze shattered those assurances with the simple weight of its existence. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received confirmation of the invasion's scale at his headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye outside Paris. The 68-year-old von Rundstedt, recalled from retirement to command the Western defenses, had expressed skepticism about the Atlantic Wall's ability to repel a determined assault. He had argued for mobile defense in depth, concentrating armored reserves that could counterattack once the main landing site was identified. Hitler had rejected this strategy, insisting on forward defense and fragmenting the armored reserves under competing command structures. Now, von Rundstedt confronted the consequences of that decision. Reports flooding his headquarters described an invasion force of unprecedented magnitude striking beaches his forward defenses were supposed to hold. The armored reserves that might have contained the landings remained frozen, awaiting authorization from a headquarters that could not be contacted because Hitler was asleep and no subordinate dared disturb him. Von Rundstedt recognized immediately that the battle was developing in the worst possible manner for German forces. Yet even he, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced commanders, struggled to grasp the full scale of what he was facing. German intelligence had estimated Allied amphibious capability at approximately 3,000 vessels, perhaps, sufficient to land 12 to 15 divisions in the initial assault. This estimate reflected careful analysis of Allied shipping, production rates, and the logistical requirements of amphibious operations. It was not an unreasonable calculation based on available information. It was simply wrong by a factor of 2, and that error reflected not intelligence failure, but a fundamental inability to comprehend the scale of American industrial output. The United States by 1944 had mobilized industrial capacity that dwarfed anything in human history. American shipyards produced Liberty ships at a rate of 3 per day. Aircraft factories delivered military planes at rates exceeding 8,000 per month. Tank production had reached 2,500 vehicles monthly. Truck production, the humble vehicles that would prove decisive in sustaining operations, exceeded 50,000 units per month. German planners who calculated Allied capabilities based on European industrial standards had no framework for understanding production on this scale. The landing craft that now approached the Norman beaches represented this industrial capacity made tangible. The 4,126 landing craft in the invasion fleet included types that German naval architects had never designed because German industry lacked the capacity to build them in meaningful numbers. Landing craft tank, or LCTs, could discharge 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto beaches. Landing ship tank, the massive LSTs that American servicemen nicknamed Large, Slow Target, stretched 328 feet in length and could beach themselves to disgorge entire tank companies through opening bow doors. DUKW amphibious trucks, the name derived from manufacturer codes but inevitably pronounced duck, could swim ashore and drive directly to combat units, solving logistics problems that German planners had never conceived solutions for. At 6:30 a.m., the first assault waves touched the Norman beaches. Along a 50-mile front from Utah Beach in the west to Sword Beach in the east, American, British, and Canadian forces began the liberation of Western Europe. The German defenders who had watched the Armada approach now confronted it directly, their carefully prepared positions under assault by forces that seemed unlimited in men, material, and willingness to spend both. For some German positions, the initial hours of the landings suggested that the Atlantic Wall might hold. At Omaha Beach, where the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions assaulted cliffs defended by the veteran 352nd Infantry Division, the geography favored the defenders. Bluffs rising 100 to 170 feet overlooked a crescent beach that offered no cover, no concealment, and no escape. German machine guns in concrete bunkers created interlocking fields of fire that covered every meter of sand. The first waves of American infantry walked into concentrated fire that would produce the highest casualties of any D-Day beach. Heinrich Severloh, at Widerstandsnest 62, later, claimed to have fired over 12,000 rounds from his MG-42 machine gun through the morning hours, a figure that historians have debated but that reflects the intensity of the defensive fire. American soldiers fell by dozens, by hundreds. Bodies accumulated at the waterline, tumbled in the surf, lay scattered across sand that turned red with blood. Landing craft struck obstacles that ripped open their hulls. Tanks fitted with flotation screens sank in the rough seas, their crews drowning before they could fire a shot. For desperate hours, the assault on Omaha Beach teetered on the edge of catastrophe. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army from the cruiser USS Augusta offshore, monitored reports from Omaha Beach with growing alarm. By mid-morning, he was considering the possibility of evacuating the survivors and redirecting follow-on waves to Utah Beach or the British sectors. The Atlantic Wall, at this one critical point, seemed to be holding. Then the destroyers came. The moment that German officers would later identify as the turning point at Omaha Beach occurred at approximately 8 a.m. American destroyers, observing the slaughter on the beach and the stalled assault waves, made a decision that violated standard naval doctrine. They closed with the shore, ignoring the risk of grounding on sandbars, ignoring the charted minefields, ignoring the possibility of return fire from German batteries. The USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt approached to within 1,000 yards of the beach, point-blank range for 5-inch naval guns, and began engaging individual German strongpoints with direct fire. At such range, the destroyers couldn't miss. Each 5-inch shell carried 35 pounds of explosive. The guns could fire 15 rounds per minute. German positions that had survived the preliminary bombardment, that had emerged from their bunkers to man weapons and mow down infantry, now faced naval gunfire delivered with precision that artillery support couldn't match. One by one, the strongpoints that had turned Omaha Beach into a killing ground began to fall silent, their concrete walls penetrated, their defenders killed or driven underground. This action, documented in naval records and post-war testimony, demonstrated something that German officers found more troubling than the simple application of firepower. The Americans had risked destroyers, valuable warships representing years of construction and training, as expendable assets to solve a tactical problem. The USS Corey had been lost that morning. Others might be lost supporting the beach assault. The American response was not to preserve remaining vessels, but to commit them more aggressively, accepting losses as the cost of maintaining momentum. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, had no destroyers to spare. Every vessel represented irreplaceable capability that could not be risked in close-range duels with shore batteries. American commanders operated under different constraints entirely. They could lose ships because they had more ships. They could spend destroyers because American shipyards would build replacements. The industrial capacity that had produced nearly 7,000 vessels for this single operation could absorb casualties that would cripple any European navy. As the morning sun climbed over Normandy, German defenders along the entire invasion front began to understand what they were facing. It was not simply a larger invasion than expected. It was an industrial system mobilized for war on a scale that made traditional military calculations meaningless. The armada stretching from horizon to horizon was not just an invasion fleet. It was American productive capacity made visible, democracy's latent power unleashed, the full weight of a continental economy directed at destroying the Third Reich. Oberleutnant Ohmsen, still directing fire from Crisbecq Battery as American forces pushed inland from Utah Beach, watched the endless procession of vessels discharging men and equipment onto shores his guns were supposed to protect. His battery had achieved what it was designed to achieve. engaging enemy vessels, scoring hits, sinking the USS Corrie. The tactical success was real. It was also irrelevant. For every ship his guns damaged, 100 others landed their cargoes unopposed. The mathematics of industrial warfare had rendered individual achievement meaningless. The German officers who witnessed that first morning of the invasion would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. They had seen something their training had not prepared them for, something their ideology had assured them could not exist. They had witnessed an opponent who measured military capability not in divisions or tactics, but in factories and production lines. The nearly 7,000 ships that emerged from the dawn on June 6, 1944, announced that American industrial might had come to Europe, and nothing would ever be the same again. June 6, 1944. 6:35 a.m. Omaha Beach, Normandy, Staff Sergeant John Robert Slaughter of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, felt his Higgins boat grind to a halt on a sandbar 300 feet from shore. The ramp dropped. The world became noise and chaos. German machine gun fire, the distinctive ripping sound of MG-42s cycling at 1,200 rounds per minute, swept across the water. The men in front of Slaughter went down before they could take a step. Others leaped over the sides, seeking the illusory protection of water already turning red with blood. Slaughter, 19 years old, a Virginia farm boy who had trained for 2 years for this moment, dropped into chest-deep water and began wading toward a beach that looked like the end of the world. What Slaughter witnessed that morning defied the optimistic projections that had characterized Allied planning for Omaha Beach. The preliminary naval bombardment, which planners had calculated would suppress German defenses, had largely missed its targets. Bombers that should have cratered the bluffs had released their ordnance too late, striking farmland miles inland. The amphibious tanks that were supposed to support the infantry assault had launched in seas too rough for their canvas flotation screens. Of 32 D.D. Sherman tanks assigned to the first wave, 27 sank before reaching shore. Their crews, trapped in steel coffins designed for land warfare, drowned in the cold channel waters while the infantry they were meant to protect walked into machine guns without armored support. The 352nd Infantry Division defending Omaha Beach had not been included in Allied intelligence assessments. German units had rotated positions in the weeks before the invasion, and the 352nd, a veteran formation recently reinforced with Eastern Front survivors, had replaced the static coastal division that planners expected to encounter. The German soldiers occupying Widerstandsnester 60 through 74, the designation for the fortified resistance nests overlooking the beach, possessed training and motivation that the Green American divisions had never faced. For the first time in the war, American infantry encountered German defenders who knew their business and held terrain perfectly suited to defense. The geography of Omaha Beach created a natural killing ground that German engineers had enhanced with methodical thoroughness. A crescent-shaped beach approximately 300 yards deep at low tide rose to a shingle bank of smooth stones, then to a seawall varying from 4 to 12 feet in height, then to bluffs ranging from 100 to 170 feet that dominated every inch of sand below. The Germans had positioned concrete bunkers in the draws that cut through these bluffs, the only exits from the beach, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. Minefields protected the draws. Barbed wire channeled attackers into killing zones. Artillery observers on the heights called down mortar and artillery fire on any concentration of American troops. Heinrich Sieverloh, the young German soldier manning an MG-42 at Widerstandsnest 62, would later describe the morning in testimony that historians have found both compelling and controversial. By his own account, he fired continuously from the moment the first landing craft touched shore, pausing only to change barrels when the steel glowed red from friction heat. The ammunition belts stretched in long lines from his position, fed by loaders who worked with the mechanical precision that German training demanded. Sieverloh claimed to have fired over 12,000 rounds that morning, a figure that may represent the total ammunition expenditure of his position, rather than his personal count. What remains beyond dispute is that the German defensive fire at Omaha Beach produced casualties that exceeded every other landing sector combined. The American soldiers who survived the initial landing found themselves pinned against the seawall and the base of the bluffs, unable to advance against fire they couldn't effectively answer. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, one of the first units ashore at the western end of Omaha, suffered 96% casualties within 15 minutes of landing. Individual rifle companies lost their officers, their sergeants, their communications equipment. The carefully planned assault fragmented into isolated groups of survivors huddling behind whatever cover the beach provided, knowing that German artillery was registering on their positions and that staying put meant eventual annihilation. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army from his position aboard the cruiser USS Augusta 12 miles offshore, received fragmentary reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. Radio communications had broken down. Most of the sets that hadn't drowned with their operators failed on the salt-soaked beach. The information reaching Bradley came primarily from naval vessels observing the chaos through binoculars. Scattered reports of burning vehicles, bodies in the surf, assault waves pinned down without visible progress. By mid-morning, Bradley was seriously considering diverting follow-on forces to Utah Beach or the British sectors, effectively abandoning Omaha to whatever forces remained alive on its blood-soaked sand. The German defenders, observing from their fortified positions, initially believed they were witnessing the defeat of the invasion at their sector. The Americans came ashore in masses that suggested limitless manpower, yet those masses died in masses that suggested limitless vulnerability. The Atlantic Wall was holding. The fortifications that Field Marshal Rommel had constructed were performing precisely as designed. Oberst Ernst Goth, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment defending the eastern portion of Omaha Beach, reported to division headquarters that the enemy assault had been stopped at the waterline. His message reflected what every German observer could see. The beach was covered with American dead, and the Americans still alive showed no signs of being able to advance. Then the destroyers came, and the battle transformed. At approximately 8 a.m., American destroyer commanders observing the catastrophe unfolding on Omaha Beach made decisions that violated standard naval doctrine, but reflected the combat judgment that the Navy had cultivated through 2 years of Pacific warfare. The beachhead was failing. Infantry couldn't advance. Tanks had drowned. Artillery support from offshore was falling too far inland to suppress the German positions that were slaughtering American soldiers by the hundreds. The situation demanded intervention that accepted risk to the vessels in exchange for decisive effect on the battle. The USS Carmack, USS McCook, USS Frankfurt, and USS Doyle closed with the shore, ignoring the charted minefields that were supposed to protect German positions from exactly this kind of naval intervention. The destroyers approached to within 1,000 yards of the beach, ranges at which their 5-inch guns could engage individual bunkers with direct fire. Naval gunfire that had been falling ineffectively across the bluffs now began striking specific targets identified by observers who could see the concrete emplacements clearly through their optics. Each 5-inch shell carried 35 pounds of explosive. The naval guns could fire 15 aimed rounds per minute. At 1,000 yards, the gunnery was nearly point-blank by naval standards. One by one, the German strongpoints that had been pouring fire onto the beach began to fall silent. Bunkers that had survived the preliminary bombardment couldn't withstand sustained direct fire from guns designed to penetrate armored warships. German machine gun positions that had been invulnerable to rifle fire and hand grenades disintegrated under high explosive shells delivered with precision that field artillery couldn't match. The German defenders experienced this intervention as a demonstration of what American industrial capacity actually meant in tactical terms. They had expected naval gunfire. Every coastal defense doctrine accounted for bombardment from offshore. They had not expected American commanders to risk valuable warships at ranges where German shore batteries could engage them effectively, at distances where a single mine could sink a vessel worth years of construction time. The American willingness to expose destroyers to destruction in order to solve an infantry problem reflected a calculus that German naval doctrine couldn't accommodate. The Kriegsmarine had no destroyers to spare. Every German vessel represented irreplaceable capability, assets that had to be husbanded against future need. American commanders operated under different constraints entirely. They could lose ships because American shipyards would build replacements. They could spend destroyers as tactical tools because the industrial capacity that had assembled nearly 7,000 vessels for this single operation would replace any losses within months. The Germans were conserving assets. The Americans were spending them. The difference proved decisive. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Canham of the 116th Infantry Regiment had been shot through the wrist early in the landing. He wrapped the wound in a bandage and continued forward, rallying men from scattered units with what survivors remembered as controlled fury. At the seawall, Canham encountered soldiers who had taken cover and showed no signs of advancing. His response became one of the most quoted commands of D-Day. "Get off the beach. They're killing you here. If you stay, you'll die." The logic was irrefutable. The beach offered no safety, only delayed death. The only survival lay in attacking the positions that were producing the fire. Similar leadership emerged along the entire length of Omaha Beach. Junior officers and sergeants, their senior commanders dead or out of communication, made independent decisions to advance. Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Division, moved along the beach under fire, organizing groups of survivors into assault teams. At one point, he reportedly told men of the 5th Ranger Battalion, "Rangers, lead the way," words that would become the Ranger motto. These individual acts of initiative, multiplied across hundreds of small groups along the beach, began the transformation from catastrophe to breakthrough. The combination of destroyer gunfire suppressing German positions and infantry initiative creating movement toward the draws started producing results by late morning. German defenders who had been firing continuously for hours began running low on ammunition. Their resupply system, designed for sustained defense over days, couldn't keep pace with consumption rates, driven by the target-rich environment the American landing had created. Some positions fell silent not from American fire, but from exhausted ammunition stores. Others were abandoned, as defenders recognized that continued resistance meant death without possibility of withdrawal. By noon, American forces had secured footholds at the western and eastern ends of Omaha Beach. Small groups of soldiers had climbed the bluffs through gaps in the defensive wire, cleared trenches with grenades and bayonets, and begun attacking German positions from above. The defenders who had seemed invincible in their bunkers at 7 a.m. were being overrun by 1 p.m. The Atlantic Wall, at this critical sector, had held for approximately 4 hours. Then it broke. The cost of those 4 hours would dominate American memory of D-Day for generations. Omaha Beach suffered approximately 2,400 casualties on June 6th, roughly half of all American losses across the 5 invasion beaches. Some rifle companies effectively ceased to exist as organized units. The beach that German commanders had believed would halt the invasion became instead a testament to what American forces could achieve when industrial capacity provided unlimited reinforcement, and the willingness to accept casualties matched the enemy's willingness to inflict them. While Omaha Beach consumed attention and blood in quantities that overshadowed other sectors, the remaining invasion beaches demonstrated the success that overwhelming force could achieve against static defenses. At Utah Beach, where the 4th Infantry Division landed, a navigational error that deposited assault waves nearly 2,000 yards south of their planned positions proved fortuitous. The actual landing site was less heavily defended than the planned one. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president and the only general officer to land with the first assault wave at any beach, made an on-the-spot decision to adjust the entire landing plan. "We'll start the war from here," he reportedly told his officers, and the improvised attack caught German defenders off balance. Utah Beach casualties totaled approximately 200 men, a fraction of the Omaha toll. By nightfall, American forces had linked up with paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions fighting inland, and had secured a beachhead that would prove essential to the eventual capture of Cherbourg and its port facilities. The contrast with Omaha illustrated both the importance of circumstances in amphibious operations and the resilience of a system that could absorb catastrophic losses at one point, while succeeding brilliantly at another. The British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, produced results that fell between these extremes. British forces at Gold Beach landed approximately 25,000 men and advanced 6 miles inland against moderate resistance. Canadian forces at Juno Beach faced the strongest German defenses of any Commonwealth sector and suffered casualties second only to Omaha, yet still achieved their D-Day objectives. At Sword Beach, British forces linked up with the 6th Airborne Division east of the Orne River, though traffic congestion on the narrow beach slowed the exploitation phase that might have captured Caen on the first day. The German 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to intervene on D-Day, launched its counterattack at approximately 4 p.m. The division had spent the day paralyzed by command confusion, conflicting orders, and the chaos that British airborne operations had created in their assembly areas. When the attack finally commenced, approximately 100 tanks and associated infantry advanced toward the gap between Sword and Juno beaches, driving for the sea to split the British lodgment. The attack achieved initial success against infantry, unsupported by the tanks still struggling to get off the beaches. German panzer crews saw the channel before them, seemingly open, apparently offering the possibility of reaching the water and isolating British forces. Then they encountered the full weight of Allied naval gunfire. Forward observers with the British infantry called down fire from vessels offshore that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. HMS Warspite, a veteran of Jutland in the First World War, now serving in her second great conflict, turned her 15-inch main battery on the advancing German tanks. The shells, each weighing nearly a ton, were designed to penetrate battleship armor. Against Panzer IV's weighing 25 tons, the effect was catastrophic. Tanks that had survived years of combat in Russia, that had crews experienced in defeating Soviet anti-tank weapons, simply vanished under hits that left craters where vehicles had been. General Major Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, watched his attack disintegrate under naval gunfire he could not answer. His tanks possessed no capability to engage warships 15 miles offshore. His artillery couldn't reach vessels that could hit any target within 20 miles of the coast. The counterattack that had seemed on the verge of decisive success collapsed into a desperate withdrawal, leaving burning hulks scattered across fields that would not see German armor again. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops across the 5 invasion beaches, including 132, 15 by sea, and 23,400 by air. This force exceeded the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy. The equipment delivered in the first 24 hours included roughly 20,000 vehicles of all types, from jeeps to tanks, and 1,700 armored vehicles. Supplies totaled 15,000 tons, sufficient to sustain operations until the logistics system could establish itself ashore. The landing craft that delivered these forces demonstrated American industrial innovation applied to the specific problems of amphibious warfare. The 4,126 landing craft in the invasion fleet represented dozens of specialized types, each designed to solve particular challenges that German military engineers had never addressed, because German industry lacked the capacity to build such vessels in meaningful numbers. Landing craft, tank. The LCTs that could beach themselves and discharge 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto sand, operated in numbers that transformed amphibious doctrine. German coastal defense theory assumed that tanks would require port facilities for unloading, that any landing site without a harbor would be limited to infantry operations. The LCT eliminated this assumption. American forces could land armor anywhere the vessels could reach shore, regardless of port facilities. The landing ship, tank represented an even more dramatic capability. These massive vessels, 328 feet in length with a beam of 50 feet, could approach a beach, open their bow doors, and discharge entire tank companies, 14 to 18 Shermans, in minutes rather than hours. The LST's flat bottom allowed it to ground on gentle beaches, and ballast tanks could adjust trim to maintain stability during unloading. German naval architects had designed nothing comparable because German strategic doctrine assumed that amphibious operations would proceed through captured ports. The Americans had simply engineered around this requirement. The DUKW amphibious truck, pronounced Duck by the soldiers who operated them, solved logistics problems that German planners had never conceptualized. These vehicles could launch from ships offshore, swim through surf zones that would swamp conventional boats, drive up beaches, and deliver supplies directly to combat units miles inland. The DUKW eliminated the critical gap between ship and shore that had constrained every previous amphibious operation. German observers who watched DUKWs emerge from the surf and rumble up beaches as casually as commercial delivery trucks recognized they were witnessing something entirely new in military logistics. The variety and quantity of specialized equipment cascading onto the Norman beaches throughout June 6th demonstrated the industrial depth that American mobilization had achieved. Tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, anti-aircraft vehicles, bulldozers that cleared obstacles and carved roads through the sand, trucks that would form the basis of supply lines stretching eventually to the German border, engineer equipment for bridge construction, road repair, and airfield building, medical vehicles configured as mobile aid stations, communications trucks that would establish the command networks necessary to coordinate forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. German intelligence had estimated Allied amphibious capacity at roughly 3,000 vessels capable of landing 12 to 15 divisions. The actual invasion fleet exceeded this estimate by a factor of 2. More importantly, the intelligence estimate had focused on the initial landing capacity without adequately accounting for the follow-on echelons that would sustain operations indefinitely. The ships that landed the first wave returned to English ports, loaded additional forces, and returned to Normandy. This conveyor belt of military power would continue operating for weeks, months, until the campaign ended. General der Infanterie Erich Marx, commanding LX Corps from his headquarters in St. Lo, had spent D-Day attempting to coordinate a defense against an attack that exceeded anything his forces were configured to resist. His single artificial leg, the legacy of Stalingrad, did nothing to slow his movement between command posts as he struggled to understand the scope of what he faced. By evening, Marx had concluded that the invasion could not be contained with the forces available to him. He requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. The request was denied. Hitler had ordered that every meter of ground be held to the last man. Within days, Marx himself would become a casualty, killed when Allied aircraft strafed his command vehicle on June 12th. His death illustrated the tactical reality that D-Day had established. German officers could not move in daylight without risking destruction from the air. The Allied air supremacy that had put 14,674 sorties over the invasion beaches on June 6th would maintain constant presence over Normandy throughout the campaign. German reinforcements moving toward the front found themselves attacked continuously, their vehicles destroyed, their schedules disrupted, their effectiveness degraded before they ever reached combat. The German forces defending Normandy had demonstrated on D-Day that determined infantry in prepared positions could inflict terrible casualties on attacking forces. They had shown that the Atlantic Wall, properly constructed and resolutely defended, could hold for hours against even overwhelming assault. What they could not demonstrate was any capacity to prevent the Allies from absorbing those casualties, reinforcing their success and continuing operations regardless of losses. The American system that had produced nearly 7,000 ships, that had trained the crews to operate them, that had manufactured the tanks and trucks and ammunition that filled their holds, could sustain losses that would have crippled any European military. The mathematics of industrial warfare, visible in every wave of landing craft that touched the Norman sand, guaranteed that German tactical successes would produce strategic defeats. As darkness fell on June 6th, the Allied forces held a lodgment 50 miles wide and varying from 2 to 6 miles deep. The bridgehead was fragile, vulnerable to counterattack, far short of the ambitious D-Day objectives that planners had established. Caen, which British forces had hoped to capture on the first day, remained in German hands and would not fall for weeks. The beachhead at Omaha remained so shallow that German artillery could reach the waterline. Airborne forces remained scattered across Normandy, some units isolated and fighting for survival. Yet the essential fact of June 6th was not what the Allies had failed to achieve, but what they had accomplished. They had established forces on the continent of Europe in strength that German counterattack could not dislodge. They had demonstrated that the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's vaunted defensive barrier, could be breached by opponents willing to pay the price of entry. They had proven that industrial capacity, properly applied, could overcome defensive fortifications, air opposition, and even catastrophic losses at individual points. The German officers who had witnessed the invasion from their bunkers and observation posts understood by nightfall that they had experienced something unprecedented. They had not merely faced a larger enemy force. They had confronted an industrial system mobilized for total war, a system that could produce nearly 7,000 ships for a single operation, that could lose destroyers and tanks and entire infantry companies without affecting its operational capability, that could absorb on Omaha Beach alone casualties that would have paralyzed a German division. The armada they had watched approach through the dawn had delivered not just soldiers, but the certainty of their own eventual defeat. The Atlantic Wall had held for hours. It would not hold for days. The forces streaming onto the Norman beaches would continue streaming, day after day, week after week, until the German armies in France were destroyed or driven back across the Rhine. The mathematics of industrial warfare, demonstrated in the ships and aircraft and vehicles that had made D-Day possible, would determine the campaign's outcome regardless of tactical developments. The German officers who understood this on June 6th recognized that they were witnessing not just an invasion, but the beginning of the end. Section 3. The Mathematics of Elimination. From Mulberry to Falaise, June 7th, 1944. D-Day +1. Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot Oberleutnant Hans Grünberg banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109 through scattered cloud cover at 15,000 feet, his cameras capturing images that would confound German intelligence analysts for days. Below him, off the Norman coast between Arromanches and Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, something impossible was taking shape. The Allies were building harbors, not capturing ports, not improvising jetties from available materials, but constructing entire artificial harbors from prefabricated components that were arriving by the shipload from England. Grünberg's photographs reached Army Group B headquarters within hours. The analysts who examined them initially suspected deception, perhaps dummy installations intended to mislead German reconnaissance about actual Allied intentions. The scale of what the images revealed seemed to exceed reasonable capability. Massive concrete caissons, each the size of a 5-story building, were being towed across the channel and sunk in precise positions to create breakwaters. Floating roadways stretched from shore to artificial pierheads anchored miles offshore. Ships that German coastal defenses were supposed to prevent from landing were instead unloading directly onto engineered structures that hadn't existed 48 hours earlier. The Mulberry harbors represented industrial capability on a scale that challenged German comprehension. Planning had begun in 1942, when British engineers recognized that the invasion of France would require port facilities that German demolition teams would certainly destroy before capture. Rather than depend on capturing intact harbors, the Allies would bring their own. The engineering challenge was unprecedented. Create temporary ports capable of handling the supply requirements of armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Ports that could be assembled in days rather than years. Ports that could survive the Channel's notorious weather. The solution emerged from the combined efforts of British and American engineers working with industrial resources that only the Allied economies could provide. The Mulberry harbors consisted of several integrated components, each manufactured in British shipyards and assembly facilities. Phoenix caissons, massive concrete structures ranging from 1,672 to 6,044 tons, would be sunk to create breakwaters protecting the inner harbor. Bombardons, floating steel breakwaters, would provide additional wave protection offshore. Whale floating roadways, flexible steel structures mounted on concrete floats called beetles, would connect pierheads to the shore. Lobnitz pierheads, platforms that rose and fell with the tide on steel legs, would provide stable unloading points regardless of tidal conditions. The statistics of the Mulberry construction defied German calculation of what was industrially possible under wartime conditions. The two harbors, Mulberry A for American forces at Omaha Beach and Mulberry B for British forces at Arromanches, required 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadway, and 93 ships deliberately sunk as part of breakwater construction. The operation to tow these components across the channel employed 132 tugs and required precise coordination to position elements within the narrow time window between the invasion and the channel storms that would inevitably test the structures. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, returning to France on June 10th, after his interrupted trip to Germany, received briefings on the Mulberry harbors that reportedly left him visibly shaken. According to post-war accounts from his staff, Rommel studied aerial photographs of the construction in progress and recognized immediately the strategic implications. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying the French ports, calculating that denying the Allies harbor facilities would create supply constraints that would doom any invasion to eventual failure. The Allies had simply engineered around this strategic assumption. They had eliminated the requirement for ports by creating their own. The Mulberry harbors became operational with remarkable speed. Within 2 weeks of D-Day, Mulberry B at Arromanches was handling 9,000 tons of supplies daily, more cargo than many established French ports could process. The artificial harbor would eventually land over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies before its mission concluded. Mulberry A at Omaha Beach suffered severe damage in a channel storm on June 19th and was eventually abandoned, its salvageable components incorporated into the British installation. Yet even this setback demonstrated Allied industrial resilience. The loss of one harbor merely redirected supplies through the other and through beaches that had been developed for direct unloading. German logistics officers studying reports of the Mulberry operations struggled to reconcile what they were witnessing with their understanding of military capability. The Reich had required years to construct the Atlantic Wall, a defensive system that the Allies had breached in hours. The Allies had constructed functional harbors in days. The disparity in industrial tempo, in the speed at which each side could translate resources into capability, revealed itself as perhaps the most decisive factor in the campaign. Throughout June 1944, the contrast between Allied abundance and German scarcity intensified with each passing day. The supply convoys that crossed the Channel operated with the regularity of scheduled ferry services, their cargo holds filled with the materiel that modern armies consumed in quantities that German quartermasters found difficult to comprehend. Ammunition expenditure rates particularly illustrated the disparity. American artillery battalions fired without restriction, confident that resupply would match consumption regardless of how many shells they expended. German artillery commanders rationed rounds, calculating how many they could afford to fire while maintaining reserves for the critical moments when bombardment might prove decisive. The battle for Caen, which dominated the eastern sector of the Normandy campaign throughout June and July, demonstrated both German defensive capability and the ultimate futility of resistance against unlimited firepower. British and Canadian forces had hoped to capture Caen on D-Day itself, securing a critical road junction and positioning themselves for breakout operations toward Paris. German defenders, anchored by the 21st Panzer Division and reinforced by SS Panzer units, including the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, held the city against repeated attacks that produced mounting casualties on both sides. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend entered the Normandy battle as one of Germany's most formidable formations. Composed largely of teenage volunteers from the Hitler Youth Organization and commanded by veterans of the Eastern Front, the division combined fanatical motivation with genuine tactical competence. Its commander, SS Brigadeführer Fritz Witt, had served with distinction in Poland, France, and Russia. The division's tank crews had trained extensively, and their Panthers and Panzertreifers represented the finest armored vehicles Germany could produce. The Hitlerjugend fought with desperate determination throughout the Caen battles, launching counterattacks that temporarily halted British advances and inflicting casualties that strained the attacking forces. At Authie on June 7th, at Buren on June 8th, at multiple points around the Caen perimeter, SS Panzer Grenadiers demonstrated that German infantry remained formidable opponents when properly led and adequately supplied. The division's defense of Crisbecq airfield in early July required repeated British attacks before the position finally fell. Yet the mathematics of attrition worked inexorably against even the most capable German formations. The Hitlerjugend entered battle with 20,540 men and approximately 150 tanks. After 6 weeks of continuous combat, the division had been reduced to roughly 300 men and no operational tanks. The unit had lost 8,000 soldiers in the Falaise pocket alone during August. These losses reflected not tactical failure, but the impossibility of sustaining combat against an opponent who could replace losses while the defender could not. The preliminary bombardment for Operation Charnwood, the British assault that finally captured Caen on July 9th, illustrated the firepower disparity with brutal clarity. On the evening of July 7th, 467 RAF heavy bombers dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on Caen in 40 minutes. The weight of explosive ordnance delivered in a single raid exceeded the entire bomb tonnage the Luftwaffe possessed in France. German defenders emerging from the rubble to man their positions found a landscape transformed into lunar desolation, buildings reduced to rubble, streets blocked with debris, communications severed, and any coherent defensive plan disrupted beyond repair. The pattern established at Caen repeated throughout the Normandy campaign. German forces would establish defensive positions, often with considerable tactical skill. Allied forces would mass firepower, naval guns, heavy bombers, massed artillery, and obliterate those positions through sheer explosive weight. German survivors would establish new positions further back. The cycle would repeat until German forces either withdrew beyond artillery range or were destroyed. Operation Goodwood, launched on July 18th, deployed 2,000 heavy bombers to prepare the ground for British armored advance east of Caen. The bombardment consumed 7,000 to 700 tons of bombs in the opening phase alone. German positions that had resisted infantry attacks for weeks were annihilated in minutes. Yet the operation also demonstrated the limits of air power. When British tanks advanced beyond the bombed area, they encountered German anti-tank defenses that remained intact and suffered heavy losses before the advance stalled. General der Panzertruppe Leo Freiherr Geyer von Schweppenburg, commanding Panzer Group West, had argued throughout June for mobile defense that would concede ground to preserve armored strength for decisive counterattack. Hitler rejected this doctrine absolutely, demanding that every meter of Norman soil be defended regardless of cost. The result was precisely what Schweppenberg had predicted. German armor was fed piecemeal into defensive battles where it was destroyed by firepower it could not effectively answer. When Schweppenberg persisted in his recommendations, he was relieved of command, joining the growing list of German generals dismissed for acknowledging strategic realities. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy that began on July 25th, brought the campaign to its decisive phase through concentration of firepower that German defenders simply could not survive. The plan called for carpet bombing of a rectangular area measuring 6,000 by 2,000 yards, through which American armor would advance into terrain beyond the continuous defensive lines that had confined the beachhead for 7 weeks. The bombardment force assembled for Cobra exceeded anything previously concentrated against a tactical target. 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers would deliver 3,300 tons of bombs on a target area barely larger than a small town. The German forces defending this sector, primarily the Panzer Lehr Division supplemented by infantry units, occupied positions that intelligence had identified as the hinge point of the German defensive line. Breaking through here would unhinge the entire Norman front. The Panzer Lehr Division had entered the Normandy campaign as one of Germany's premier armored formations, a demonstration unit organized to showcase German armored doctrine to foreign military observers. Its personnel represented the cream of German tanker training. Its equipment included the newest variants of Panther and Panzer IV tanks. The division had fought continuously since June 9th, suffering steady attrition that had reduced its strength but not eliminated its combat capability. On July 25th, approximately 3,000 men of the division occupied the target area for Operation Cobra. The bombardment commenced at 9:38 a.m. For the next 2 hours, American aircraft delivered explosives at rates that transformed the target area into a moonscape of overlapping craters. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr, survived the bombardment in a command post that collapsed around him. His subsequent report to higher headquarters captured the apocalyptic destruction his division had experienced. My front lines look like the face of the moon, and at least 70% of my troops are dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. Of the 3,000 German soldiers in the target area, approximately 1,000 died instantly. Another 1,000 suffered wounds that removed them from combat. The final 1,000 were so psychologically shattered by the experience. The endless explosions, the burial under debris, the screams of wounded comrades, the complete helplessness against attack from above, that they could not function as military units. The Panzer Lehr Division, which had entered Normandy with 190 tanks and 16,000 men, effectively ceased to exist as a formation. It had not been defeated in battle. It had been industrially eliminated. The Cobra bombardment also produced one of the war's most significant friendly fire incidents. Navigation errors caused some bomb groups to release their loads short of the target area, killing 111 American soldiers and wounding 490. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces and the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. The tragedy illustrated the inherent imprecision of heavy bombing against tactical targets and the willingness of American commanders to accept catastrophic accidents as the cost of maintaining operational tempo. The breakout that followed Cobra shattered German defenses with speed that exceeded even optimistic Allied projections. American armor poured through the gap created by the bombardment, advancing 30 miles in the first 3 days. German units attempting to establish defensive lines found American forces already behind them, cutting communications and supply routes. The static warfare that had characterized the first 7 weeks of the Normandy campaign gave way to mobile operations that German forces lacked the strength to resist. General George S. Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, exploited the breakthrough with aggressive advances that carried American forces to the Seine River within 3 weeks. Patton, whose reputation for mobile warfare had been established in North Africa and Sicily, drove his armored divisions forward at rates that German commanders found impossible to counter. His spearheads advanced 40 to 60 miles daily, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting supply lines, and creating chaos throughout the German rear area. The logistics that sustained Patton's advance demonstrated American industrial capacity at its most impressive. Each armored division required approximately 1,000 tons of supplies daily when advancing: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and the 1,000 other items that modern mechanized forces consumed. The Red Ball Express, the emergency truck convoy system established in late August, would eventually deliver 12,500 tons daily across routes stretching 400 miles from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front. The system employed 5,158 trucks operating 20 hours daily, consuming 300,000 gallons of fuel simply to deliver fuel and supplies to the combat forces. German commanders observed the American logistics system with a mixture of professional admiration and strategic despair. Their own forces operated on a fraction of American consumption rates, not by choice, but by necessity. A German division considered itself adequately supplied if it received 200 tons daily. American divisions received 5 times that quantity as routine allocation. The disparity translated directly into combat capability. American artillery fired without restriction, while German artillery rationed shells. American tanks advanced, knowing fuel trucks followed, while German tanks calculated whether enough fuel remained to reach their objectives. The Falaise Pocket, which developed between August 12th and 21st, as Allied forces encircled German armies retreating from Normandy, became the graveyard of German military power in France. American forces driving east from Cobra linked with British and Canadian forces pushing south from Caen, creating an encirclement that trapped the bulk of 2 German armies in a pocket roughly 20 miles wide. The only escape route, a gap near the town of Falaise, narrowed daily as Allied forces converged. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated from desperate to apocalyptic. German columns attempting to withdraw clogged roads that Allied aircraft attacked continuously. Fighter bombers operating in cab ranks, standing patrols that could be directed to targets within minutes. Destroyed vehicles, artillery pieces, and horse-drawn transport with industrial efficiency. The Allied air forces flew over 12,000 sorties against the pocket in its final days, consuming ammunition at rates that would have exhausted German reserves within hours. The scenes that Allied forces witnessed upon closing the Falaise Pocket entered military memory as among the most destructive of the war. A Polish armored division sealing the final gap at Cherbourg reported passing through what resembled an enormous junkyard of destroyed equipment. Dead horses, essential to German logistics, in an army that remained 60% horse-drawn, lay in heaps, alongside burning vehicles. German soldiers surrendered in masses, their units destroyed, their officers dead or missing, their will to continue resistance broken by the futility of fighting an opponent they could neither see nor answer. The documented statistics from the Falaise Pocket recorded destruction on a scale that ended German military capability in France. Between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers died within the encirclement. Between 40,000 and 50,000 were captured, most in conditions suggesting complete organizational collapse rather than tactical surrender. Equipment losses included 344 tanks and assault guns destroyed in the northern sector alone. 2,147 soft-skinned vehicles abandoned or destroyed, and 252 artillery pieces lost. Perhaps 20,000 to 50,000 German soldiers escaped the encirclement, but they emerged as disorganized remnants rather than fighting formations, without heavy equipment, often without personal weapons, capable of flight, but not of resistance. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, who had served as chief of staff to both von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Günther von Kluge during the Normandy campaign, provided post-war analysis that captured the German strategic perspective. "We were not defeated by better soldiers or superior strategy," he concluded. "We were buried under an avalanche of materiel." The battle for Normandy was not a military campaign in the traditional sense. It was an industrial equation, and we were on the wrong side of the mathematics. The production statistics that defined the Normandy campaign illustrated Allied industrial dominance with numerical precision. German aircraft production in 1944 reached 39,807 units, a remarkable achievement for a nation under continuous bombing. American aircraft production in the same year totaled 96,319 units. German tank production peaked at approximately 1,154 vehicles monthly in December 1944. American tank production exceeded 2,400 vehicles monthly throughout the year. German military truck production totaled approximately 68,000 vehicles for all of 1944. American military truck production reached 650,000 vehicles in the same period. These statistics didn't include British, Canadian, or Soviet production, all of which supplemented American output in the combined Allied war effort. Germany was fighting the industrial capacity of the world with the production of a medium-sized nation increasingly degraded by bombing and resource constraints. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, calculated after the war that the Allied advantage in war production by 1944 was approximately 5-1 across most categories. In certain areas, like trucks, the mundane vehicles that determined whether forces could be supplied, the ratio exceeded 10-1. Total American wartime production encompassed figures that explained how the Normandy campaign had developed as it did. The United States manufactured 297,000 aircraft during the war, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million military trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Each of these numbers represented capability that the Normandy invasion had deployed and the Normandy campaign had consumed. The nearly 7,000 ships that had appeared off the Norman coast on June 6th were not the limit of American capability, but a fraction of it. Deployed for a single operation, while production continued at rates that would deliver replacement for any losses within weeks. The German officers who survived Normandy emerged psychologically transformed by the experience of fighting an industrial war against an opponent with unlimited resources. They had witnessed not merely military defeat, but the complete invalidation of assumptions about what warfare required. Young officers who had grown up under Nazism, who had been told that Americans were soft and corrupted by luxury, discovered instead that Americans had machines to do the hard work that German soldiers performed manually. Radios to coordinate operations that German forces managed through couriers, unlimited ammunition to train with and fight with, and confidence that derived from knowing that support would always be available. Field Marshal Walter Model, who assumed command of German forces in the West in mid-August after von Kluge's dismissal and subsequent suicide, assessed the situation with characteristically brutal honesty. "We face not a superior army, but a superior civilization," Model reportedly told his staff. "They make no effort to hide because they don't fear us. They waste resources because they have infinite resources. We cannot defeat this with military tactics." Model would continue fighting, professionally and effectively, for another 8 months. But his assessment reflected the understanding that had crystallized among German officers at Normandy. The war had become an industrial contest that Germany had already lost. The suicide rate among German officers spiked dramatically following the Normandy campaign. Defeat in battle was one thing. Professional soldiers understood that wars produced winners and losers. The complete invalidation of their worldview was another matter entirely. The ideology that had promised German superiority, that had explained military success as the product of racial virtue and national will, collapsed under the weight of American trucks and British bombers and Canadian infantry that kept coming regardless of casualties. Some officers chose death rather than accept what Normandy had revealed about the premises upon which they had built their careers. In 1954, 10 years after D-Day, surviving German officers gathered in Bonn for a private symposium on the Normandy campaign. According to accounts from participants, the discussions focused less on tactical decisions than on the fundamental question of how Germany had so catastrophically miscalculated Allied industrial capacity. General der Infanterie Blumentritt, delivering the keynote address, articulated conclusions that represented the consensus of officers who had witnessed the invasion firsthand. "We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally," Blumentritt reportedly stated. "It was no longer a contest of armies but of economic systems. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured courage while they measured production. The image that haunts me still is the sight of American bulldozers pushing aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks. We were not fighting an army. We were fighting an industrial complex that had decided to destroy us and possessed the capacity to accomplish its objective, regardless of what we did." The German officers who watched nearly 7,000 Allied ships approach on June 6, 1944, witnessed more than an invasion. They witnessed the transformation of warfare into industrial mathematics, where production capacity would prove more decisive than tactical brilliance, where logistics would determine outcomes that combat could only confirm. The armada stretching from horizon to horizon was not merely an invasion fleet. It was American industrial might made visible, democracy's latent power mobilized, the full weight of a continental economy directed at destroying the Third Reich. Walter Ohmsen, the naval artillery officer who had first sighted the invasion fleet from Crisbecq Battery, survived the war and the subsequent decades. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, he returned to Normandy as part of reconciliation ceremonies that brought together veterans from both sides. Standing at the observation post where he had witnessed the impossible armada, Ohmsen reflected on what that morning had meant. 40 years ago, I stood here and saw the impossible, Ohmsen stated, according to accounts from the ceremony. A sea covered with ships from horizon to horizon. I knew in that moment that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. Divided nations don't coordinate such an invasion. I fired my guns at that armada, and I might as well have been throwing stones at the tide. The lesson that Ohmsen and his fellow German officers learned on June 6, 1944, extended beyond military history into fundamental truths about industrial civilization and its capacity for organized violence. They had prepared for war as they understood it, war between armies that would be decided by courage and skill and tactical brilliance. They met instead the full industrial capacity of the United States, capacity that could produce ships faster than German forces could sink them, tanks faster than German gunners could destroy them, soldiers faster than German defenders could kill them. The mathematics of defeat had been visible in that first dawn, written in steel across the waters of the English Channel. Nearly 7,000 ships announced that American industrial might had come to Europe. The German officers who witnessed their approach understood, in that moment of terrible clarity, that they were seeing not just an invasion, but the future of warfare itself. Warfare where industrial capacity would trump every other consideration, where the side that could produce the most would inevitably defeat the side that fought the hardest. The beaches of Normandy had become proving grounds for a new kind of war as industrial process rather than military art. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's vaunted defensive barrier, had held for hours against forces that would sustain operations for years. The German armies in France had been destroyed not by superior tactics or better soldiers, but by an opponent who could replace every loss, answer every attack, and continue operations regardless of what resistance they encountered. In the end, the lesson of D-Day was arithmetic. The Allies had more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more trucks, more ammunition, more everything that industrial warfare required. They had systems to deliver these resources where needed, trained personnel to employ them effectively, and the organizational capacity to coordinate operations of unprecedented complexity. Against this, German courage and German skill and German defensive positions proved insufficient. The mathematics were irrefutable, and mathematics doesn't negotiate. The sea of ships that German observers watched approach on June 6, 1944, carried democracy's verdict on fascism, industrial civilization's judgment on military adventurism, and the accumulated productive capacity of nations that had mobilized totally for war. The German officers who witnessed that armada understood they were seeing something that would change warfare forever. They were correct. The world that emerged from the beaches of Normandy would never again doubt that industrial capacity was military capacity, that production was strategy, and that the nation commanding the most factories would command the battlefield. The nearly 7,000 ships had announced this truth in a language that required no translation. The German officers who watched them come understood the message immediately, even as they manned their guns and fought their doomed defense. They were witnessing the end of war as they had known it and the birth of something new. Something measured in tons delivered and sorties flown and vehicles produced rather than in courage or sacrifice or tactical brilliance. Something that had already determined the war's outcome before the first soldier touched the beach. The mathematics of industrial warfare, visible in every wave of landing craft, every squadron of aircraft, every convoy of supply ships that followed the invasion fleet, guaranteed that D-Day would succeed and that Germany would lose. The only questions remaining were how long the process would take and how many would die before the mathematics completed their inevitable work. The German officers who understood this on June 6, 1944, knew that they were not witnessing the beginning of a campaign, but the beginning of the end.